My name is Randall Cross. Today is the 10th of March, 2016, and I'm interviewing John Pototschnik at the Smith Public Library. Would you please state your full name and date of birth?
Yes, I'm John Pototschnik. I was born in November of 1945, November 14th, 1945.
Okay. Why don't you start by telling me where you were born?
I was born in St. Ives, Cornwall, England. My dad was in the World War II in the military station in England. Met my mother, who was a nurse, and my dad was in the medical profession, or helped with the doctors. And they met, and I was born there. And then the war ended in '45. My dad came back to America, set up a house in Wichita, Kansas. And my mother brought me over on the Queen Mary. So she was one of those notorious British war brides.
Okay. And
so I was just a baby. I was probably 5 months or so old when I came over.
Now your dad, did he have work lined up?
Yeah, he was in the printing business. So he had work as a linotype operator with a local newspaper. I think it was in Wichita at the time.
Where was his family from?
His family was from, Yugoslavia. I think his grandmother was from, and his dad was from Austria, I believe is how that worked out. And they came over just around the time of the Depression, I think, to America. And they resided in Pittsburgh, Kansas, which is in southeast Kansas.
How long was your father in the printing business?
Pretty much my whole childhood. Let's see, I think he moved here to Dallas in probably about 1965, maybe, something like that. Moved to Dallas. But he worked for the Wall Street Journal here in Dallas for a while in the printing business, and then he eventually switched professions and went into a rental business.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one brother who's 2 years older than I, and a sister 3 years younger.
What was it like growing up in Kansas?
I liked it. I mean, Wichita was a smaller, it was years ago, so it was a smaller town. I call it a happy time because you just didn't have much of the concerns that you have now. I feel like it was a time of safety, and I remember going door to door and selling my mom's homemade cookies. I had paper routes, which I'd collect, for the papers, knocking on doors at night, collecting money. Went door to door selling magazines. I mean, it was just a neat time, I think. At least I have a good memory. But then as a child, you think, everything's good. But, I remember it as a really good time.
So do you think that kind of small town feel, did it continue to have an appeal to you?
Yeah, and I think that's a big reason we came to Wylie, because when we first came to Dallas area here, we moved to Garland, but we always my wife and I liked the country life because she grew up in Wichita also. And so we came from similar backgrounds. Her dad was selling real estate to farmers, so he was out in the country a lot also. And my wife would sometimes travel with him on some of those trips. So we both loved the country, and Wylie at the time was small, and gave us the opportunity to move to the country.
And what about family traditions? Any stand out in your mind? Maybe something from your mom's side?
She was very traditional. She loved all the holidays. So Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving were huge with us. We'd always have very nice meals and family get-togethers and all that. It was just all important. Yeah.
So tell me about how you got started painting.
Well, when I was in high school, I had no intention, or even when I grew up, my parents were not. We really didn't attend museums. I didn't have any exposure to the arts really growing up. But when I was in school, I just liked to draw in high school and stuff. And I think the encouragement from the fellow students, oh yeah, you're pretty good. Then I joined the poster club and got to draw a little bit more and stuff like that. So by the time I went to college, I thought I had no idea I don't know what it was, but I had really no idea one could make a living as an artist. And so I went into business administration. I was going to actually I started off as studying accounting in the business field, and after about a semester of that, I was just very unhappy with it, and went to my student counselor, and I said, well, you know, what do you think I ought to be doing? And so they gave me a battery of tests, and it showed, you know, you really like to work with your hands, create stuff. So why don't you take such and such? So I took printing classes, woodworking, metalworking, art, all that stuff, and I really thought, you know, what I really like to do is to draw. So I switched majors and became an art major, and that's how it began. And so when I did graduate from, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. When I did graduate from college, I also went through the ROTC program, so I took a commission in the Air Force. They stationed me in California. It was during the Vietnam War. I was also an athlete at the time, and so the Armed Forces had a special services program for athletes. They used it as a recruitment process to bring other, you know, athletes into the Air Force and into the Armed Services. So I was stationed in California with that, and my job was also as an information officer. So I was in charge of internal information, public information, community relations with the community there, and then I was also a newsletter editor. So I had a lot of opportunity to do drawings for the paper. I had an exhibit of my drawings out there. Also, one of the best art schools in the country was in Pasadena, California. So I would go to art school there at night, and that's how, you know, I started to grow and decide, yes, I think I really want to continue pursuing this. Growing up, my dad in the printing business had artist friends, and they said, nah, you really don't want to get into art. But when it becomes a passion, you know, you kind of pursue it regardless of what others say you should do. And I really, by that time, really liked to draw, and as I learned things more and more about the field and how to create, I fell more and more in love with it. But all through college, I was told you'll never make a living in the fine arts, so I went into the commercial side of art. And so when I left the Air Force and moved to Dallas, I started as a freelance illustrator. And freelance illustrator produces the drawings for ads. They work with art directors through ad agencies, and so I was hired freelance to create drawings for a lot of the ads they produced. I did storyboards for TV commercials, and I did a lot of print material, drawings for print. And I did that for 10 years, and then in 1982, I saw a lot of the former illustrators were moving out of illustration into the fine arts. And illustration was really changing at the time because computers were coming in. The way of producing art was was changing, and photography was really taking over more and more from you know, artists like me producing the art. So a lot of the old illustrators are moving into the fine arts, and so it was something I kind of always wanted to be from the beginning, was into the fine arts, and that gave me the courage to do it. So in 1982 I made the switch.
So that was something you had really always wanted to do, but it was a matter of being a commercial success.
Yeah, and if you remember back in that time, particularly when I was in college, all the work was abstract expressionism, and you weren't really getting a great education in the arts because everything was bent that way. So the students in the art program in the colleges, if they wanted serious drawing and learning some of the things that one needed to know and make a living at it, that was being taught in the commercial side because it was more practical. The fine art side, they could pretty much produce whatever they want and say, well, you know, put it out there in the market and say, well, it's for you to figure out. Well, in the commercial side, you had to appeal to a client and sell a product and help sell a product and all that stuff. So it was really important that you learn how to draw, you learn proportion and perspective and color and design, and all that stuff. Was a lot of emphasis was placed on that.
Do you think that's still the case, or we kind of swung back to where fine arts is more important in our education?
Oh, I think any art education is really important, but it needs to be based on sound principles, I think, rather than on emotion. You know, in other words, do your own thing, and whatever, you know, you want to create is going to be fine. I think there are guidelines of, you know, what are foundational principles of creating a good piece of art, and those are the things that I think need to be taught in any art program, because it helps one to appreciate what they're seeing every day. We oftentimes just pass over stuff and ignore it.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that, like the principles that you believe are important?
Well, for a painter like me, one of the first things is the concept. You have to decide what you want to communicate. We as artists are visual communicators, and by that I'm saying we have an audience. In other words, or the other option, just paint for yourself and let no one see it. But as soon as it goes out to the public, and I view it as we have a responsibility, therefore, to communicate with our audience. And so the concept is the number one thing. What do we want to communicate? That, of course, originates from within us. But being as we're all human, we kind of, you know, we have similar emotions. And so what moves us, we need to somehow, through the techniques involved in creating art, be able to capture that emotion and put it onto canvas so that others can feel it the way we feel it, or come close to feeling it that way. And so that's one of the main things. Have a clear idea of what we want to communicate. Then we use the other techniques of how to compose that onto a canvas. What colors are used that will best express that emotion that we want to create. How to best organize it, draw it where it's accurate in proportion and perspective, that people understand what we've created and what we've drawn, that they can relate to it. And then those are the main things. Then our personal technique, which I call similar to developing our handwriting, that personal technique we use, the application of paint, how we apply the paint, is all part of it. Of course, I'm just talking about the painting side of it. There's sculpture. There's all kinds of other ways. I mean, also people that are interior decorators are very creative too, and they pretty much use the same ideas. I mean, it's all composition and design and color within too. It's just a different way of expressing it. But for me, when I'm speaking of art, I'm speaking of painting.
How long did it take you to find your signature or your style in painting?
Oh my goodness, Randall, that takes time, and I don't know. I mean, I've done probably, if you think of all the studies and all the work I put on the market, there's probably been over 3,000 paintings so far. They say so. The best way to compare it with handwriting. I mean, when we start writing, I don't know how you were trained in school with the writing, but we did all the little loops, and all this stuff, and how to hold the pencil correctly and all that, and you learn how to form the letters. Okay, well that's real rigorous and it's unsteady and all that, but eventually you get where it just flows. But the only way that comes is because you've written up a lot. You know, your name, if your name and mine were the same, our signatures would still be different.
True.
And so it's the same with painting. I think it's just putting in the miles. They put in lots of miles of canvas is how it comes. And it just sort of eventually, as one masters the vocabulary, I call it, which are the design, composition of the drawing, the value structure of your piece, the color, all that. The value structure, I'm talking light and dark patterns in your painting. As you master those things, that's the vocabulary, then it automatically tends to flow out of you naturally without having to work at it. Just like we don't have to work at writing our name anymore, it just flows very easily. And so that takes time, as you know.
Who have been your influences in your style?
Well, I love the French painters of the second half of the 1800s. But I always mention Camille Corot, who was probably my biggest inspiration, even in college when I studied art history. Of all the master painters we studied in art history class, it was Camille Corot. He lived, I think he was born in 1796 maybe, and died in the late 1800s. but he was an influence back then. I mean, I was just drawn to his work. Why one is drawn to someone's work like that, it's hard to put a finger on it, but there was just some emotional connection there with him. So I love him. I love Francois Daubigny, Jean Millier, just that whole range. They were all in there. They were part of the Barbizon School, which was a group of painters that painted in the Barbizon forest in France. So I like them. And then some of the early American painters, Willard Metcalf, George Ennis. There's just so many, but Camille Corot, I would say, I'd put up there at the top. And people do see some of that influence in my work, not a lot, but it's, I think his approach and his temperament, the more I've read about him too, is probably more in line with mine. So maybe that's why there was an attraction there too. It's just hard to know for sure.
Do you feel like you're still changing and developing?
Yeah, I think probably so. Because the more we learn, you know, we can only paint up to our level of understanding. So the more understanding we have, we attempt and try new things, and so things evolve. I know when I first started, the things I was painting in and around Wylie, you know, that has changed, because early on I was painting more intimate scenes, in other words, close-ups of things. Now I'm interested more in vistas and mood, atmospheric moods. So yes, I'd say it has evolved that way.
Back up a little bit. When you decided to become an art major and get out of business when you were in college, how did your parents react?
My parents were great. Yeah, no problem with them. That was a real blessing from them, because they never questioned it. It was pretty much what you wanted to do, and I'm really grateful for that. There weren't expectations on me that you must enter such and such a field, or it was never about, well, you can't do that because you're not going to necessarily make a good living. You need to pick a profession that's going to provide a good living for you and your family. That was never once mentioned. So I had a lot of freedom, and I think, of course, when one has that kind of freedom, it takes some pressure off of you. You can just explore and grow much more easily, I think, because you have that approval there behind you. And it proved to be correct. I mean, they were pretty amazed at what happened with my art, from where it started, and, you know, before they passed on what they were seeing I was producing. So they were pretty amazed. So that was all a good feeling.
Good to have mom and dad as a fan.
Yeah, well, yeah, kind of that a little bit, but they were really good about that and supportive. Yeah.
So tell me about your military service. You said you were stationed in California.
Yes, I was glad I didn't have to go to Vietnam. In fact, when I first got my orders, I was actually supposed to go to Strategic Air Command base in, I think it was in North Dakota. And 68 was the year I graduated from college, and it was an Olympic year. And I was in bicycle racing, the road type of racing, like Tour de France stuff. And like I said earlier, the services had their special services and their athletes, and they had all the cyclists. Even Mickey King, I think, was an Olympic diver at the time. I think that she was stationed out in California too. And they had their athletes stationed out there, so I talked to the people at the college and said, well, you know, this is Olympic year. I'm an athlete, and I won the state championship here, and I was getting known in the Midwest with the results I was achieving in cycling. And so the president of the Amateur Bicycle Racing Association wrote to my commander there at the college and saying, you know, you ought to consider this guy for a special services team in the Air Force. So they did, and so my orders were changed from North Dakota, and they sent me to El Segundo, California. There was a Space and Missile Systems organization out there. It was kind of a think tank for communication satellites, missile systems, the Minuteman missile, a lot of that stuff there, and they had missile launches up at Vandenberg Air Force Base north of El Segundo. So my job was pretty much an office job, but I also had at the same time responsibilities as a special service athlete, and so I was really blessed in that. I was able to train every morning, and then I would go into the Air Force Base in the afternoons and do all of the work that was required there. So I trained for, I actually had that job for 4 years. I never moved. They kept me there the whole time, and I was an athlete the whole time, and also all these other things I said I was, information officer, so on. So I was leading a very busy life, and then going to school at night.
For your painting, so you were a cyclist, an information officer, and going to school.
Going to school at night, so I had no time for anything else.
So tell me about what finally brought you to Wylie.
Well, it was through cycling again. When I left the Air Force in 1972, fulfilled my obligation. California, I knew I wanted to be in freelance illustration. In California at the time, starting an independent career like that, I felt was just overwhelming, and there was a lot of, would have involved a lot of driving to and from all the agencies to show my portfolio and so forth. And my parents already had lived in Dallas, and I was familiar with Dallas, felt it was a more manageable city. And so I was married by that time. My wife and I decided to move to Dallas. And my cycling reputation sort of preceded me. And so when I came to Texas, people in the cycling community already knew who I was and said, oh, he's coming. And so I had, at that time, actually thought, okay, now I need to get serious. I'm going to lay down my cycling life and get serious about developing my illustration career. And I was married too at the time. But when I got to Dallas, I was offered, we'll prepare a bike for you, we'll sponsor you, just ride. And so I did. Picked it up for a couple more years. And anyway, through that association, I met some people, but one guy in particular who lived out here in Wylie, in fact, right near where we bought our land at the time. And we had expressed interest. We'd love to live in the country. He said, well, there's land out here by me. And so we bought the land, I think, we were living in Garland at the time. Bought the land, I think, in 73 out here maybe. And went ahead and paid that land off, and then we eventually built a house in 1980 out here. So that's how it started. It was through my cycling friend. Found a nice spot of land. And it was really country then. A lot different now.
So did it have that small town feel, sort of where you grew up in Kansas?
Oh, a lot smaller.
A lot smaller.
Yeah, it was probably under 5,000 people when we moved here. And there was nothing around us. There were no trees really out there. It was just a plot of land. And cotton, I think it was cotton fields at the time. Not at the time, but prior to, it used to be cotton fields. And so we bought about 2.5 acres. And on the Taylor, I think it's called the Taylor Estates out there, some land that Joe Taylor had owned and had been farming and decided to portion it off and sell it. So we bought a piece of land and then built in 1980. So that's how we got here. So I was still in illustration at the time, but I had an office down in the Oak Lawn area of Dallas. So when we built our house out here and completed, I shut down that office there and moved it to my studio out here. And I continued in the freelance illustration for 2 years. And then in 82, I made that switch to fine art. So I have my studio in my house.
Did you find a lot of inspiration for your work around Wylie?
Yeah, I loved it. I would go around. When I left illustration has a different look to it because you're oftentimes trying to sell a product. It has have a certain look to it. And so when I first got into the fine arts, and I would show my work to local galleries or whatever, they'd say, yeah, you're an illustrator, aren't you? And of course, when I had made the commitment to fine art, I didn't want to hear that your work looks like you're an illustrator. The tendency of illustration is it's very detail-oriented, very hard-edged, so it reproduces well, all of that. Fine art needs to be more expressive, so you have the hard and soft edges. Your color is more neutralized, probably not so garish. And so an artist friend of mine said, you know, you need to take your paints outdoors and start painting on location, and you'll find it will really help you, because the colors you will see in nature are considerably different than what you're putting in your illustrations. And sure enough, he was correct. So my whole palette changed, and I started traveling all around the Wylie area, setting up my little paint box and attempting to paint what I was seeing. And it changed my work almost immediately. And so I made a habit of doing that. I painted a lot of scenes around Wylie. And when it was still a small town, scenes from downtown, the old water tower they had over there. There were just a lot of the old houses, street scenes, the cotton gin they had out there. Do you remember when that was? In 1378 and Brown, I think it was.
No, I don't remember.
Yeah, see, it was neat. Just so much stuff around. Old barns that are no longer here now anymore. I loved painting that stuff and stand by the side road and paint. Yeah, it was an important time. The Murphy grocery store, you remember that one? Which was at 544 and Murphy Road, where the Lowe's is now.
Okay.
They had one right there on that corner. People remember that. I hear from them so much, because I've done 3 paintings of that grocery store. And I'll hear from there every now and then and say, hey, do you have any prints of that left? Because there's so many childhood memories there. And kids back then, I mean, they could safely ride their bike from over here in downtown Raleigh. They'd ride down there and get some candy or something. I mean, it was just an important to so many people around here. In fact, there's a painting here in the library that I did up the Murphy grocery store right there at the entrance.
Oh, really?
It's out there, yeah. So, yeah, but it's, I liked it back then.
Do you still paint on location around town?
I do, yeah. Every now and then I'll do. I paint, I have lots of different things out and about.
It has
mainly
changed. It was definitely more rural when you began.
Yeah, now you kind of have to look for it a little more. You know, I like the older parts of town. They still have a charm to me that I like. Still have to look. So I spend time looking.
You mentioned an email that you were commissioned to do a painting of old downtown.
Yeah, thanks to Truett Smith. I think that was 1984, 86. 1986. I'd moved here in 82, and I got involved in the community pretty quickly on, because I wanted people to realize I was an artist. I was now a part of the Wylie community, and so I did paintings of Wylie and let people know that I did these paintings, and I was involved in did some newspaper articles and so forth. And Truett Smith, I don't know exactly how we met, unless I approached him or he approached me first, but it was his idea. John, why don't you paint a picture of old downtown Wylie in about the late 1800s? And he had some old pictures. I think it was him. He gave me some old pictures of downtown Wylie, and it was full of horses and wagons, full of cotton. They'd come into town to, I guess, sell their cotton. And so I had those to work from, and I think I had 2 or 3 pictures to work from. And so I had to conceive of an idea of how to create this. And so I emptied the street out. I had the building, so I reconstructed the whole street scene without anything in the street. And it was, of course, in muddy streets and all that at the time. And then I had a friend who had some horses. So I had him pose for me with his horses, just walking them around. And I had to stand up on a ladder to shoot them at the right angle because the photos I had were elevated. They weren't at street level. You're kind of looking down on the street. So I had to get up at the right eye level. So all these horses that I had him walk around and pose for me, I had to get on a ladder to shoot them so they'd be at the right angle, looking down on them. And then I found an old wagon, I think at a McDonald's up in Allen, that was set out in the front of the McDonald's. And so I went out there with my ladder, same deal, shot the wagon from all different angles. And then back in the studio, I put the wagons and the horses together, made up all the people, and created all the activity in the street. And anyway, produced this painting. And Truett loved it, and we did prints of it, and those were sold. And I think out of that is when I met Raymond Cooper. And Raymond Cooper has been probably my biggest fan in Wylie, and has just been a great supporter of my work and encouragement and all of that. So I owe Raymond a lot. And so that's, a lot of my, I did a lot of prints, and some of those were donated to the Christian Care Center. Raymond purchased a lot of others at a very reasonable price that were all then used to raise money for the care center. So it's all kind of worked very nicely together for all of us, and that the care center could be, financed, help finance it. And I could move some of my prints, and Raymond too was able then to receive some of those, because he was, I think, overseeing or created the Christian Care Center, if I remember correctly.
So if you tried to stay involved in activities like that in Wylie?
I'm probably not as much now as I was when I was younger. It's sort of slowed down, and I kind of concentrate on my studio work more now. I'm not promoting my career as much as I used to when I was younger. Felt I needed to, establish myself and people know that I was around creating work. We did do I've done 3 paintings of the Murphy grocery store, one in '84, one in 2000, and then one in, when was it, 2002, I think it was, or 2008. Yeah, 2008. So I did one in '84, 2000, and 2008 of the Murphy grocery store. That's probably been my largest involvement as far as creating scenes from around here that people have actually seen. Like you were asking earlier, my work has evolved somewhat, and so I'm painting kind of different things now. I paint a lot of New England scenes, just a variety of stuff, a lot of European scenes also.
Do you like to travel and visit different locations, or are you mostly out of your studio?
No, I don't like the traveling part, but once I'm there, I really enjoy it, because I'm inspired by different scenes, different parts of the country. They're all inspirational to me, and I usually take my paint box along with me, my paints, and we'll try to capture the scene on location. Those paintings that I do on location they're not up for sale. They're usually, I call them little studies, and I file those in notebooks, so that I have a record of the real thing, because what the camera captures and what the eye sees are 2 totally different things. So when I'm on location trying to capture a scene, my main goal is to capture the correct light, the light source, the color of the light, and the right value structure. In other words, the relationship of sky to land to all the objects in there, that those are the right relationships in dark black to white. They're done in color, but they all have a value to them. They fall somewhere on a grayscale from black to white. So I get that balance correct, and then I feel in the studio, if I have the knowledge of what the correct balance is, I can create a painting in the studio that looks like I painted it right in front of the scene, which is what I want to do. That's the feeling I want my paintings to have.
How well did you know Rita and Truett Smith?
Did not know them really well. Truett was pretty much a business relationship. Rita, she invited me into their lovely home some years later. I think Truett had already passed at that time, to see her great art collection. And she liked my work. And I think I did a painting of the Catholic Church, stood out there on the street and painted that over a 3 or 4 day period. That painting, I think, was in her house, but I don't know if she was the original purchaser of it or not. I just can't remember for sure how that all evolved. But I did do a painting of the Catholic Church. I know this is an interesting story, because when they built the new Catholic Church, the plan was to take down the existing one, the old one that's now standing. And I did not like that idea at all. And so I wrote a letter to the bishop of this diocese, pointing out the reason that they should not take that church down, that it represents, a lot of Wylie's history. And Father Pond was involved. He wasn't for necessarily keeping it, if I remember correctly. So we had a meeting, and through the letter to the bishop and associations of other people, involvement of other people, we got the church to stay, which I'm really glad it's still there.
I think we are too.
Yeah. So that was part of, I guess, part of my involvement in the city. Also wanted to keep the water tower. Do you remember the water tower?
No, that was gone when I got here.
Yeah. Well, that was another thing, wanted to keep. It was right where the park is right now, the city park. And but that was pretty much nixed very quickly. I think the city manager showed up at that meeting and said, "There's no way we're keeping it. It's going to be too expensive to keep it, because it's a danger, and it needs a lot of repair," which all made sense. But man, it was so nostalgic to have that there. And I did several paintings of that relative to the buildings around it. So of course, being an artist, I love that stuff, because the old stuff has the character to it. The new stuff doesn't have the character. So I love the old buildings, and I like those things that were remnants of our past, which I love to paint. And they're just great memories. All the records of the paintings I've done for 30-some years now, I mean, they're all records, and they're a history of where I've been and what I've seen. And what you're doing is going to be the same kind of thing here. It's going to be great history for people. Wow, that's what it was really like. So it's kind of neat to have that.
Do you have a favorite story from your career?
I don't know if you'll like this one, but when I came out here, they had an old box car, from a train on 544. I think the guy's name was, they called him Big John or whatever. People around here will know who he was, but I guess he was an eccentric guy. He sure proved to be that to me. There was this box car right there. It was kind of a burned out box car. It was kind of yellow and red mixture, but the inside was all burned out. But it was parked right there on 544, heading towards Murphy. That really intrigued me, because when I first got into fine art, I was doing a series of paintings for the oil and gas industry. In fact, that's what helped me get into fine art. And one of the paintings I had was a picture of this box car in it. And so I conceived of this idea: I can use this box car and show wildlife and oil and all that all at the same time. So I went out there and stopped by the side of the road and walked inside. Back farther off 544 were a bunch of buildings back there, which looked like storage buildings and so on and so forth. And I thought, it's a business back there. And so I just walked inside the gate, and not a gate, it was just a fenced, regular drive-through entry, but it had a fence around the property. But the driveway was all open. I just drove in, parked there, and got out my camera and started walking around shooting photographs of that boxcar. It wasn't long, and there come two guys down the road with their pickup truck, jumped out of the pickup truck, got probably one of the guys, who I think was the Big John guy. He got about a foot from my face, very angry. "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm shooting pictures of this boxcar." "Well, I can see that. You know this is private property?" "Oh, I didn't know it was private property. There's buildings back here. This looks like a public area to me. I can drive in here and come back there and do business with you." He says, "No one gave you permission to do that." And he gave me this big old lecture about shooting pictures of this boxcar, which offended him. And then he ends it by saying, "What have you learned here today?" No, he started off and said, one of the other things he asked, "Where are you from?" I said, "Well, I grew up in Kansas." He says, "Oh, you're a half-assed Yankee." And I, anyway, the thing just ended up a mess. He sticks his face in mine. He says, "What have you learned here today?" And I said, "Well, I've learned for sure that I need to ask permission before I step inside this fence to shoot photographs." He says, "You got that right." And so that was the end of that. Not a happy occurrence. So that was probably the one that sticks out the most. But I had, there was another lady lived out there by me on 1378. Her name was, what was it, Verna? Yeah, Verna McDonald Douglas. And she was an old lady. She had a brother who lived right over here off of right on Brown Street by the railroad tracks. And she lived out there on 1378, had a large piece of property, an old farmhouse, and some barns back there. Well, I could see her place from mine, and of course I was doing a lot of painting outside at the time, and I'd wander around, and I became friends with her. And we would talk, and she was just a neat lady, and she said, "Oh yes, John, you can go anywhere you want on my property to paint," which is what I did. Well, one day I went over there, and the lighting was just right. And because she had a big tree in her backyard, and the lighting was such that it cast these fantastic shadows across the back of her house. And there were a bunch of cats around her house. These cats would just gravitate to her from all around, and she'd feed them. And so she probably, I don't know, man, she must have had 10, 20 cats that would come around. And I conceived this idea, man, I think I could do a painting of her coming out of the back of that house and feeding the cats with this dramatic shadow in the back of her house. So I went over there and I said, "Verna, what do you think if I do a painting of you coming out of the back of your house feeding the cats?" Because as soon as she put the food out, she'd drop it down on her back porch there. Anytime the cats would. And so we arranged it, and I went over there at the proper time of day. Well, that particular day, she said, "John, I'll do whatever I can for you to make you successful." I just love that about her. So I said, "This is what I want to do, Verna." So what I did not know, she had false teeth. So the day she came out, she was all dressed up for me. I said, "No, Verna, I just want you very natural. Don't have to dress up." So she went in and changed back into her normal everyday clothes. But she didn't put in her false teeth. And so her mouth was sort of sunken in, and it just made the painting perfect. And so I did the painting of her, and I was so happy with the painting, I submitted it to an art show in the Bosque County Conservatory in Clifton, Texas. I think it's in Clifton. And I won the Best of Show with that painting. Well, one of the awards, the winner was able to not only get a substantial cash award, but you were encouraged to spend that money to study. And so with that money from that painting I did with Verna, I went to Old Lyme, Connecticut, and studied for 1 semester up there, human anatomy. And so that was all because of her out here in Wylie. So I have great memories of her. She was a neat lady. And then her brother lived right over by the railroad tracks on Brown, and I did a painting after a snow that Wylie had. It was wet, and the snow had started to melt, and Brown Street was just picking up all these fantastic reflections at the time. And so I shot some photographs over there, did a painting of that, and that painting won one of the top awards in the Oil Painters America show. So, it's these Wylie scenes. I've had some successful paintings created from here. This has been really nice. In fact, I think that painting is out there in the lobby also, the one that won the award. So there's two out there in the entry to the library here, which are a result of Raymond Cooper again, who purchased those paintings and donated them to hang here. Yeah, that painting, the Murphy grocery store painting that's out there right now, it's called Remembering Murphy Grocery. That was the second painting of the three that I did. And we initially, Porter Carter had a gallery here in downtown Wylie for a while. Or was it Carter Porter? Let me see here. Yeah, Carter Porter. Had a gallery in Wylie here for a while. And I was represented in that gallery for a while. And so we decided when I created that Murphy painting to do an auction. So we auctioned it off through the gallery. And a guy named Mike Kittleson, also a Wylieite, grew up as a neighbor of ours. He was a little bit older than my boys at the time, but he purchased the painting in the auction, and then just a few years ago he donated it to the library. So that's how it ended up over here.
You mentioned at the oil and gas industry, that helped you transition into fine arts.
Mm-hmm.
How did that occur?
That was a good friend of mine named Wilford Webb. He was a Dallasite, but he was a vice president at Texas Oil and Gas. We went to the same church together, and that's how I met him. And he knew of me being an artist, and he loved art. He was sensitive to the arts. And I had expressed an interest to leave illustration and to move into the fine arts. And so that gnawed at him, I think, a little bit. And he came up with an idea. He says, John, the oil and gas industry is really getting a bad rap of how we're going in, destroying the environment and not fixing it up after we're done drilling or whatever. He said, that's not necessarily true. You need to see what's really going on. And he said, you ought to think about producing some paintings that show that wildlife and oil industry can coexist. And so he took me around to, he's made the introductions for me that I could go to various oil sites, drilling sites, and see what they were doing. And then, so we came up with an idea, he came up with an idea of producing a series of paintings, we did 6 altogether, of showing that wildlife and oil industry could coexist. And so, through his contacts, we found 6 corporate sponsors, and the plan for them was to, they would contribute a certain amount of money, and in exchange for the money they would get, in the order that they signed up, they would get the first pick on their painting of choice, and then they would get 1/6 of the total production of the prints that I did. In other words, they would get one of every print, 1/6 of the total number. I think the total run of each print was 500, so we just divided that by 6. And then they each got a set nicely packaged as a group, and then they could do with those what they wanted. They could sell them, they could give them to their contractors, their customers, whatever. And so it was really a way to launch me into fine art, which it took me a year to do that project, but it was enough to provide for a year. And then I launched into the fine arts from there, but it was because of him.
Did you have an opinion one way or the other on the oil and gas industry?
I learned afterwards, just seeing that they did seem to care. I think there's probably a little bit of both. I mean, it's not just a totally pure industry that they clean everything and leave it pristine necessarily, but the things I saw, I was pretty impressed with. I was impressed with the people in the field, all of that.
Looking back on your career, what lessons have you learned?
In what way?
Anything that you would pass on to someone, or advice you would offer?
Yeah, for the arts, a good foundation. I never got a great education in art. Now the things are changing because we're moving. I think the taste right now in art is moving away from abstract expressionism more back towards realism, and students, art students, have found that it's kind of an empty. It leaves an empty feeling. Abstract expressionism by itself, but being able to actually draw what one sees and draw it very well is satisfying, and people relate to it more. So there's a return to realism. So right now there's some great teaching being done, some great schools where a young student can really be educated. So I'd say what I learned is you've got to have really sound fundamentals in the arts to be able to make a career of it. And I've learned perseverance, because there are lots of ups and downs. It's not uncommon, unlike many other industries or professions, in that the economy will affect, how you're doing. But art does seem to be one of the first things that people will generally stop purchasing when the economy's tight. They just don't have the money to put paintings up in their house. But I've learned the perseverance. You got to stick with it regardless of the sales or how you feel, and you got to have the discipline to work every day regardless of how you feel. It's not I do not work based on motivation. I work as it's a job, and I go to it every day, just like I would if I was employed by somebody and had to show up. So those are the things. I enjoy the relationships with people a lot that purchase my work, because there's a connection made when that happens. There's something that I've created, which is a neat thing in itself, being able to create something and then have someone appreciate it to such an extent I put out a nice amount of money for it because they think it's that valuable to them. That means a lot to me. And I think to any artist it does. So those things are all good. And then it's always always feel the blessing of God in that, because that's a hard way to make a living, but we've always been provided for and pay all our bills, so can't be more grateful than that. There was a lady in Wylie, Randall, Ida Mae Green, and when I was painting a lot on location too, she I don't know what street, because I don't know my streets around here that well, but she had a house right here, prominent in Wylie, and she always was known for her irises she had out front. Did you ever hear about her?
No.
She'd be out there with her apron and her big blue bonnet, and would be working in those irises, and that always caught my eye. And so I did a painting of her one time, tending her irises, I think is what I call the painting. She had this really neat, the old style bonnets she had there, and big thing tied under the neck. She was out there working with that. Just some nice experiences with some of the older folk around here. Really enjoyed.
Has faith played a big part in your life? You mentioned church. And
I was, it has, yes. I became a Christian in 1972, and it's dramatic change when you understand what God's done for us. And it's a free gift, so it's been changed, and what we are called to do is trust in Him for all things, which I try to do. Sometimes it's difficult because we get so overwhelmed by circumstances sometimes, but we're always called to trust in Him. He cares about us deeply and will provide and care for us. regardless of circumstance, there's no limitation to his goodness and love and ability and mercy toward us. And so, for me and my family, that's who we trust in and continue to grow in him, as I say. I think it's important, critical to life. It's nice to know where you're going, have that kind of assurance, because many people do not know where they're going. You're unsure, and they think the standard for eternal life is, well, my good stuff outweighs my bad stuff, and so I'm basically a good person. And I think that can be very deceptive, because how do you judge goodness next to God when He is absolute perfection? So our standard, whatever our highest standard is, doesn't measure up to His standard. And so we have to rely on Him. And He tells us what's necessary, and He says perfection. And of course we can't attain perfection on our own. So it's only through His Son that we attain it.
Well, speaking of growing and knowing where you're going, and obviously community has played an important part of your life here. What can Wylie do as a city to hang on to those roots that you appreciated when you first moved here?
Golly, Randall, that's a tough one. I think bottom line, everything is spiritual, but as far as returning, I don't know if we can return. You know, a lot of things I paint as a painter are physical. They're the things we see with our eyes. And so I don't know if we'll ever capture that. I don't see how that can be captured again. Those days are gone. The land's been covered up and built on. But I think Wylie is strongest if it's strongly committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, I believe. I think life is spiritual. I really do. That will repel a lot of people by saying that, but I think it is. Life is absolutely spiritual. And what happens inside of us in the spirit will manifest itself in the outward. And so the more we are connected with the Lord Jesus Christ as our hope and Savior, it will affect everybody inside, in their inside, and that will affect the community. And the way we act, the way we treat each other, the way we design and build, the way we want to be servants to one another, all that stuff is based on our spiritual belief. And I think that would be the strongest thing for Wylie. Strong churches preaching the Word of God in a strong, dramatic way. Truth, in other words, truth, not distorting the truth. Preaching the truth will change people's hearts. And that changes a community. And I think that's what will make Wylie strong, strong, strong.
It sounds like a hopeful message, and you're optimistic about the future.
It depends on the pastors here, and the church today, to me, seems like it's more interested in giving people what they want to hear, making them feel good, rather than preaching the gospel regardless of how people respond to it. As a pastor, they have a responsibility to me to preach the Word of God accurately, without any distortion, and preach it completely. Don't just pick pet subjects. Preach the whole Word of God. And God is the one responsible to make that Word stick and change people's hearts. Our responsibility is to preach it truthfully. And from that standpoint, yes, I think it will change. It'll change people. God loves people, so He wants His Son to be known and the Word to go forth. But I think that's a hope for our country. It's a hope for, our country's falling apart because we're losing our foundation. And I think that's true all the way down to states, to small communities like Wylie, and to individual homes. If you lose your foundation, you end up with a very confused home, city, state, and country. And I think we're at that place right now.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you'd like to add as we wrap up?
Yeah, this is kind of funny, but when Wylie started to transition, I got a lot of speeding tickets because they started putting up the signs around here, down to 40 miles an hour and slowing down. I mean, 544, huh?
What did it used to be? What was the speed limit before?
I was driving Park Road at 70.
Okay.
It was pretty easy. You could drive, they were all 2-lane roads. Parker Road was 2-laner. 544 was a 2-lane winding road all the way into Plano. And so when they started changing and Wylie started growing, I had a hard time adjusting, to be honest with you. In fact, it came to a point where I had enough tickets that I was notified, you're going to lose your license. And so I was supposed to go up, and I did. I went up to, I don't know where there was a judge, who it was now, because it was a long time ago. But I had to meet with I'll say a judge up on 380, up towards McKinney, but off of Highway 78. And I walked in there scared to death, and I thought, man, if I can't drive anymore, they were going to take it away for 6 months, I think they said. If I can't drive anymore, my business is going to really be affected. I don't know what I'm going to do. My wife's going to drive me everywhere. I walked in there, the guy was so friendly. He knew who I was, and all he wanted to talk about was art. We just had some good laughs. He said, now, John, you need to slow down. And so that did it. I slowed down from then and was able to adjust, but I was scared. I think that's about it. We had I've had good memories. Glad I live here, and in some ways I'm sad to see all the growth, but I understand it. I mean, my wife and I laughed, yeah, you just want to be the last one to move out here. Everything before you is okay, but you're the last one. But that's stupid. So, but I've been here a long time. Since 1980 we moved out here. So seen a lot of changes, and then of course the Rita Smith this library and the school and all of that. It's changing so much. I know when we used to drive to our home, we'd drive by once we got to the intersection of South Fork Ranch there, Murphy Road and Parker Road. You would never, hardly ever see a car come east of that intersection when we first came out here. Now it's just a solid line of cars. Developments everywhere. It's amazing.
You've come a long way.
It really has. We send all our boys through school here, kind of like you, I guess. Did you go to Hartman, you said?
No.
Oh, you didn't go to Hartman? Oh, you just went to
high school here.
Oh, high school. I thought you said maybe middle school and high school. Okay. Yeah, our boys went all through all the schools here. So, anyway, a lot of memories.
All right, well, I want to thank you for taking the time to come in here and talk to me and share your stories. This concludes the interview with John Pototschnik on the 10th of March, 2016. The interviewer was Randall Cross.